Today's daf we're going to be learning is Vachim Daf Mem Tet. We're going to start at the bottom of Mem Chet Amud Bet. So we're trying to figure out, after we proved that doing the chatat in the northern part of the Azara, after we learned that that is essential. By the way, I said something in class. I don't even remember how I said it in class yesterday. I guess it was on Friday. We talked about the Pesach, and someone asked about the space in the Azara, the space in the, and I just want to make sure the Pesach has to be sacrificed in the Azara, just not in the northern part. So people could spread out into other areas, but it has to be done in the Azara. Just to make clear, I thought maybe afterwards that I didn't listen back, but that wasn't made clear. Like, don't think it could be done outside the Azara. The Shechita has to happen in the Azara, just not necessarily only in the north. So I just wanted to correct that in case it wasn't clear. But now we prove that the sin offering has to happen specifically in the north, and if not, it's disqualified. Now, for everything, we're going to have to prove that it says it twice, because if it says it twice, that means, right, we've already learned this many times, there's all these principles, we're going to talk about more of them today, that are unique to Kodashim. If it says it once, that means nice thing to do, but you don't have to do it. If it says it twice, it's essential, which actually is very confusing, because if the Torah says do it this way, right, how do you know when it's essential, when it's not? And that's really what they're struggling with. Right? We need to know, is this essential? Is this not essential? So, right, it's quite confusing. Normally it says do this, and it means you have to do it, right? So in Korbanot, it's a little bit strange. Some things are l'mitzvah, some things are la'akiv. So now, I mean, we do see this in other areas as well, but not with such clear-cut rules. So now we said, okay, that's for the sin offering. We proved that we have it multiple times. That teaches you it's essential, both for shechita, kabbalat adam, for where the person who's holding the blood, just not the shochet. Remember, that was the exception. The shochet could not necessarily be in the northern part. Then we said, okay, what about Ola? And the Gemara said something that seems pretty intuitive and obvious, which is, well, if the whole mitzvah of chatat is learned from Ola, because it says slaughter, right, the only place that's mentioned explicitly in the north is in the Ola offering, the burnt offering. So if that's the original halacha, then anything that's learned from it, if we just prove the sin offering has to happen in the north, and if not, it's disqualified, obviously that should be the same thing for the original law. And use the words, right? Did you ever see such a thing? That the secondary item is more important and more has a harsher law than the original one? Doesn't make any sense. So now, Amalei Marzutra, we're at the very bottom of Mem Chet Amud Bet, the last words. Is that not true? And now we're going to bring 3 attempts to try to say, here, we're going to show you. Sometimes the secondary item can actually be more strict than the original item itself. Hare ma'aser. We're talking about ma'aser sheni. This is your fruits in your house. You're supposed to bring the second tithe, which is bring it to Jerusalem and eat it there. But you can't always schlep all your ma'aser to Jerusalem. So they allow you to redeem it on a coin. Well, ma'aser duhu nifteh can be redeemed, right? So that means it's got that's a certain leniency. Ve'ilu lakoch b'ma'aser b'kesef ma'aser eino nifteh. Now, when you go to Jerusalem, what happens? You buy produce. Okay, you can buy produce, you can buy animals, you can buy all sorts of things, any kind of food that you can eat with the ma'aser sheni money. Now, we're going to go with Rashi, even though there's another way to read this, but according to Rashi, we're talking about it's not nifteh if it becomes tameh. If it becomes impure, you can't redeem it. So now, ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah. Tanakama says, if it becomes impure, you can redeem it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer yikavel. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bury it. There's nothing you can do with it. So what do you see here? If your maaser sheni produce at home got tameh, it would be fine. You could redeem it. But if when you got to Jerusalem and you bought with the money other stuff, and maybe became impure, you have to bury it. So what do you see? Obviously, what you buy with the money is secondary, and the law is more stringent. But the Gemara rejects this and says, no, there's a reason why you can't redeem what's bought from the money of Maaser Sheni. Why is that? Hatam lo alima kedushate lemitvas pidyone. This is a very interesting theory. In order to be able to redeem something, it has to have a lot of sanctity, or enough sanctity to be able to redeem it. Now, the items that you bought with that money, the assumption here is every time I move it on to something else, I took the fruits, I took the sanctity, I moved it onto a coin. I got to Jerusalem, I took the coin, I bought something from it. Each time, it kind of gets lighter in its sanctity. So because it's lighter in its sanctity, Okay, now you would think lighter in its sanctity means we could be more lenient, but no. You can't actually redeem. Redemption is only possible with something that's really sanctified. This is already so removed from the sanctified item that it's just not potentially able to be redeemed. And that's a totally technical issue, that there's just no option for redemption here. Not that we're going to be more strict with it. Okay, it's just we'd like to let you redeem it. Theoretically you can, but this isn't redeemable. So that's rejected. Okay, next one. Hare Tmura. This is a similar thing, but different. You have an animal you sanctified, and then you say, I want to remove the sanctity and put on another animal. You're not allowed to do that, but it is effective, meaning the sanctity goes to the next animal. Okay, so what are we talking about within Tmura? Well, ilu kodashim lo chayle abamum kavu. If I go take an animal, and I say, I want to use this animal for my sacrifice, and the animal is blemished, has a permanent blemish, nothing happens. It's a meaningless act. I've done nothing. There's no sanctity on the animal because there's a Baal Mum. But ilu ihu ihi chayla. But if I had a nice animal that I designated for a sacrifice, and then I said, you know what, I want to redeem it. I want to flip it, substitute a different animal in its stead. And that animal is a Baal Mum. It's effective. So what do you see here? Tzmura should be less effective than the original sanctity, and yet it's more effective because it works on a blemished animal. So the Gemara explains this also from a different perspective and says, no, this has nothing to do with tafel, the tmura being chamor from the ikar, from the original, but tmura mikoch kodshim ka'atya. Kodshim mikoch chulin ka'ate. Okay, let's start with the kodshim mikoch chulin ka'ate. When I try to take an animal and sanctify it, I'm taking something that has no sanctity to it whatsoever. And I'm basically saying, I want to put, we call it yesh me'ayin, like there's nothing here of sanctity, and just my words alone are going to put sanctity on this animal. Now, that's not so easy to do if the animal is blemished. If the animal is blemished, I can't just turn this, take nothing, right, and turn it into sanctified when it's completely blemished. But if I take something that's already sanctified and I move that sanctity onto something else, that's already in the world of sanctification. There's already an object sanctified, and now I'm moving it to something else. So that actually is coming from kodshim. That's coming from something that's already sanctified, the tmura. So it's going to be easier, and the tmura is going to be effective on that blemished animal because it comes from a source of holiness already. It's not a yesh me'ayin, like it comes from nowhere. And that's the reason. Not because tafel, the secondary thing, has actually got a stricter law than the original. Third attempt. Hare Pesach. Du'e nota un smicha unisachim u'tunfat chazeh v'shok. So Pesach, you don't need to put your weight on the animal, the smicha. You don't need to bring the libations with it. You don't need to wave the chest and the thigh. Ve'ilum, now, a regular shlamim, you do these actions, but not a Pesach. Now, if you remember, what happens if you leave over your Pesach? You designate an animal, and then you don't use it for Pesach for whatever reason. Maybe you lost it temporarily, found a different one, and then found the original animal. So if it's left over from something you designated for the Korban Pesach, what happens? If you remember, it becomes a shlamim. Now, when it sacrifices the shlamim, what does it need? Smicha, right, and all those things. So ilu motar didei, which is obviously secondary to the Korban Pesach because it was designated for a Pesach but never used for a Pesach, and yet it has a more strict law. So there you have it. Here's another example of a tafel, which is chamor from the ikar because it has all these stringencies. To which the Gemara says, no, Pesach b'shar yom hashana shlamimu. This Pesach is no longer a Pesach. In other words, Pesach any day of the week, of the year, when it's not Yud Daled in the afternoon, right, is called a shlamim. So this motar Pesach just is a shlamim. It's not a Pesach. In other words, it's true it started as a Pesach, but it's just not a Pesach. It's defined as a shlamim, and that's why it has those other things. Not that we're going to treat it more strictly. It just happens to be a shlamim, like any other Pesach on any other day of the year. So that's not a disproof. So we're left with this answer. Again, our question was, we understand that you need shechita to be in the north because it says so in the Pasuk and the Kabbalat Adam, but where do we know that it's ma'akev, that if you don't do it, the korban is disqualified? And the answer is, well, if it's ma'akev for the chatat, it's obviously ma'akev for the olah, because the whole law of chatat, sin offering, in the north comes from the olah. So there's no way the rules would be stricter for the chatat than for the olah. The Gemara brings, however, a second, even though you don't need it, but they bring a second answer. Ibaidem. Alternatively, you could say, Amarkra ha'ola bimkoma tehe. So the pasuk says, V'samachet yado al rosh hachatat. It's actually by the sin offering of the Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur. It says, V'shachatet hachatat bimkom ha'ola. So this seems to be also, first of all, it says bimkom ha'ola, like they darshan, it should be in its place, and also it's the second time it's mentioned because it's already mentioned in pasuk Kaf Dalet. So they say from here, that seems to stress, not sure exactly which one is the one that really is the proof of it, right? Rashi says Chazar v'shana. He says because it says it twice, Limei makom shekavati la'ola la'olam hu mekoma. So I think he's darshaning both the repetition and the fact that it says it right next to the word mikoma, right? That bimkom ha'ola, that its place, the place of the ola, is essential. Okay, so now we get to the next question. Obviously, we did chatat, we did ola. Now we want to do asham because all kodesh kodeshim shchitatam b'tzafon. So asham minalan debayit tzafon dichtiv bimkom asher yishchitu et haola yishchitu et hasham. So this is in Vayikra Zayin where it says these are the rules for the asham. Okay, zot torat asham kodesh kodeshim hu. Okay, it's high level sanctity. Bimkom asher yishchitu et haola yishchitu et hasham. So in the place where you do the ola, which is obviously north, right? That's the place where you do the asham, where you slaughter it, yishchitu et haola, ve'etamo yizrok, and you sprinkle the blood. So now the Gemara is going to say, okay, there you have it. Needs. Okay, obviously that's only one, not ma'akev, but it does show the mitzvah. It's supposed to be done in the north. Eshkachan shchita. But before we get to ma'akev, what are we looking for next? Kabbalah minalan. How do you know the collecting of the blood has to be in the north, like we did for all the others? Ve'et damo yizrok. Now it's a little bit tricky because damo yizrok is sprinkle the blood. Now you don't sprinkle the blood; you sprinkle the blood on the altar, right? But what do they mean here? It says, let me read it inside. Like if you just continue without taking a pause there, that's where you slaughter and the blood. Okay, so and collect the blood. From there, you learn the blood has to be collected in the north. Kibul damo nami b'tzafon. Okay, that teaches you collect in the north. What's left? Two more things. Mekabel atzmo minalan. How do you know the person who collects it has to be also standing in the north, like we did for the others? Damo ve'et damo. The fact that it doesn't just say v'damo yizrok, it says ve'et damo yizrok. Et comes to include and the person. Okay, last question. Eshkachan lemitzvah la'akev minalan. How do we know it's essential? Kra'achri naktiv. Well, there's another pasuk. V'shachat et hakeves. Okay, so you have to read the whole pasuk of where are we? Now we're moving into the leper. It's going to be very significant in a minute why it's the leper. So we move to the leper. Now in the leper ceremony, he has to bring 3 sacrifices, and one of them is an asham, and an ola and a chatat, sin offering, and a burnt offering. And it says, V'shachat et hakeves bimkom asher yishchat et hachatat ve'et ha'ola bimkom ha'kodesh. Ki kachatat ha'asham hu lakohen kodesh kodeshim hu. Okay, let's get this pasuk straight because we're going to darshan it a lot right now. So the pasuk is, you should slaughter the keves, the sheep, bimkom, in the place where you slaughter. Now, what would you expect it to say? Where you slaughter the ola. But it actually says something a little different. It says where you slaughter the sin offering and where you slaughter the ola, the burnt offering. Okay, we're going to deal with that much later today. Bimkom HaKodesh, in the sanctified space. Ki kachatat ha'ashamhu. Okay, this sounds very unnecessary. Because the chatat, the sin off, because the asham is like a sin offering, okay? La kohen, for the kohen, okay? Just get this line because we're going to go back to it later. The asham ki kachatat asham, which really means the asham is like a chatat for the kohen, and then it's kodesh kodeshim. It's high level sanctity. So there's a lot of unnecessary words in the pasuk. Okay, the whole second part of that pasuk is unnecessary. So now the Gemara says, but forgetting about that right now. Right now, all we really care about is they slaughter the keves in the place where the burnt offering was slaughtered. So there you have, very simply, second comment on second time it says the asham has to be done in the north. Perfect. Exactly what we're looking for. Asham's done in the north by Zot Torat HaAsham. Asham's done in the north by Asham Etzorah, twice la'akev. Okay, perfect. But not really, because the Gemara is going to ask, wait a minute. That pasuk is needed for something else entirely. And that's why I wanted you to read this pasuk, because now we're going to bring up a whole drasha on it. Davar shaya bichlal. Okay, this is in the Bright of Rabbi Yishmael. We were talking about Ezu Mukoman Shel Zvachim, which we say in our davening in the morning, the Karbanot at the end of that whole section, right before Mizmor Shiyochan Karabayit LeDavid. There's a Bright of Rabbi Yishmael with the Yugimul Midot Chaturani Dreshabam, and this is one of them listed there. Okay, just so you know, he's not the only one. There's different people with different versions. His became famous because it ended up in the davening. Okay, anything in davening people know they're more familiar with, but there are other ways. But one of them, the he lists, is Davar shaya bichlal. If something was in the group, okay, which is going to be our korban asham, okay, there's a category called korban asham, and we assume the asham mitzorah is just part of that group of korban asham. V'yatzali dom davar chadash. But if it all of a sudden has some unique halacha that's not in all the others, which we'll talk about in a minute, I ata rashai lachziro lichlalo, you can't bring it back into its category unless ad shechzirenu akatuv lichlalo b'ferush. Unless the Torah specifically says, this is like all the others. Okay, so here's our example. Ketzad. What's an example of this? V'shachat et hakeves v'mkom asher yishchat et hachatat v'et ha'olah v'mkom hakodesh ki kachatat ha'asham hu v'chulei. Our pasuk. Why? She'ein tamud lomar kachatat ha'asham. Why did we say that? Okay, here, that's why I pointed out when we read it. At the end of the pasuk, saying, this hasham is like a chatat. Now, first of all, it already says in other places, the korban hasham is like a chatat. So, right, we started our Masechet with it. Remember the whole machloket about the Asham, is it also lo lishma? Because maybe, right, the Rabbi Eliezer who says Asham shelo lishma is disqualified as well because kachata ka'asham. Okay, that's not this pasuk. So, why did it say this? Matamud lomar kachata ta'asham lefishi atza asham mitzorah lidom b'davar chadash. Well, asham mitzorah was taken out of the klal. Why? Well, we know this. It has unique halachot. What do you do with the blood of sacrifices? You put them on the altar, or maybe sprinkle it to the parochet or the kaporet. Okay, but that's all in the realm of normal things you do with sacrifices, with the blood. But what do you do with the blood of the leper? You put on the finger and the toe and the ear of the leper. So that's a davar chadash. Bebohen yad ubohen rega v'ozen yamanit. So maybe that's all you do with the blood. Maybe you don't put the blood on the altar. Maybe you don't even burn those parts that get burnt normally in the sacrifices, the imurim. So, Talmud Lomal, kachatata ashamhu. Ma chatatu una matan damim v'imurim l'gabei mizbech. Af asham tzorata undanim v'imurim l'gabei mizbech. That's why the Torah had to bring it back in. The Torah had to rein it back in after saying there's unique halachot for the blood. It needed this pasuk to say, the asham is like a chatat. It also has the same rules besides what you do with the bohen and the ozen and all that with the blood, but you also have to do the regular things with the blood. So now, so that pasuk is needed for that purpose. Now it's a little tricky because that pasuk means the end of that pasuk, not really the beginning, and we were learning it from the beginning. But anyway, maybe that's really what the Gemara is saying in the next line, which is, Im kein dichtov b'hai v'lo nichtov b'hai. Well then, if it's really not coming to teach us that the blood is ma'akev, right? I'm sorry, that the shchita in the north and the kabbalat adam in the north is ma'akev, right? The shachat is ma'akev. So then you should have just written. You should have written the whole beginning of the pasuk. You should have just written the pasuk in Zot Torah Asham. Do it in the place, but it's not ma'akev, and it shouldn't have written it here at all. So they say, right? So then, 1 second. Oh, sorry. No, it's wrong. It's Rashi saying you should have written it Shchitat Tzafon ba'asham mitzorah and not written it in Zot Torah Asham. And then, right, that's sorry. If you're going to say that we should have said it Zot Torah Asham by the mitzorah. Sorry, we should have said it by the leper, the shachat in the place where it's done in the north, where the olah is done, and not written it a second time in Zot Torah Asham. And then you would have, as if you're trying to say it's really not ma'akev and you can't learn from here, so it should have just said it here and nowhere else. So then they say, well, that's weird you're saying that, because hanicha isviralan yatzali dom b'davar chadash iuhu delo gamar michlalo turning out amabet aval klalo gamar mineh shapir. You just said a minute ago, that's a little confusing, so I'm going to try to explain it as clearly as possible. We just said a minute ago that why don't you just say, let's say by the mitzorah, if it's not ma'akev, and as we want to prove it is ma'akev, it's necessary, it's essential. Without that, disqualified. But if you wanted to say, look, that pasuk you can't learn because that pasuk is needed for something else. So then you should have just said it here in the beginning of the pasuk, and it would have taught you here, and then you would have known for everywhere else just one time. And then don't say it in Perek Zayin when it says over Torah Hashem. Do it in the place where the olah is slaughtered, in the place where the olah is done. But Hanicha, I'm going back now to what I read without explaining. This only works Isfiralan, if you hold Yatzah Lidom B'Davar Chadash. Now, what did we say about Yatzah Lidom B'Davar Chadash? We said if something leaves the group, because there's a unique halacha, like the putting the blood on the ear and the nose and the ear and the finger and the toe. That's only if you say, and then we wanted to say, well, we can learn from here to everything else. So that's only if you say, when it says it leaves the klal, then you can't learn from everything to the mitzora. You can't learn to the leper about the matan damim, right? Unless it said kachata kasham. But, right, iu de lo gamar michlalo. You can't learn this case because this case was exceptional. You can't learn from it. You can't learn the laws of it from other places unless the Torah specifically says so. But klalo gamar mine, but you could learn from it to other things. In other words, the whole premise of the question was saying, why don't you just write it by the leper and learn from there to everywhere else? That it's mentioned once, which means do it, but it's not essential. That was the question. Obviously, that's not the case, but they were saying, why didn't you just do that? The fact that it says it in both should teach you, right, both, that it's essential. But that's only if you think that once it leaves the klal, right, without reining it back in and saying this is part of the klal, well, you can't learn to it, but you can learn from it. Because otherwise, if you can't learn from it, then there's no question to be asked here. So, and that's what they're going to say, Ela isviralan. But if you hold that something that leaves the klal and has unique laws, it can't go either direction, right? De lo gamar michlalo velo klalo gamar mineh. You can't learn from others to the leper, and, right, which would mean we wouldn't necessarily know about the bloods, what to do with them. And also, you can't learn from the leper to anywhere else. If you say that, then your theory is irrelevant, right? Then this pasuk couldn't have taught you about everything else, and that's why you need two pasukim. And at this point, we would say then, okay, so one pasuk is for the leper, one pasuk is for everywhere else, and you can't learn that it's essential because there's no two places where it's overlapping, because these are two completely separate issues, because it was separated from the group. So they say, right, and if that's the case, Hai legufe itzrich. And then this pasuk is needed specifically to tell you about the leper, because you wouldn't have learned it from anything else, and you wouldn't have learned anything else from it. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, and this is why it's a little confusing that they even suggested this, because kevan da hadre ahadre. But what do you mean? In the end, they said, ki hachatat kachatat ha'ashan. It is like everything else. That was all predicated on the beginning part that it was out of the klal, but it was actually brought back into the klal. So of course you could learn from there to everywhere else. And then we're back to our question. Yeah, you could have just written it, if it wasn't essential, write it by the leper. Since anyway they said the leper is like every other sin offering, which means it's also like every other asham offering. And then learn from here to all the asham offerings. And then it would be lemitzvah and not lakev. So even though we need this pasuk for something else, we still could learn from it the fact that it says it here, do the shechita in the north, or like the olah, and it says there, right, in the regular asham, do the shechita where the olah is done. Well, then you could say it's makev, because in the end, it doesn't matter that it took it out of the general, it brought it back in. So now it's a little weird they even asked that question, because it's obvious they brought it back in. That was the whole thing. It's Yetzam in a klal, right, but it was brought back into the klal, So why they even think this? So the next line should help us understand why they even thought it. Amarle Marzutra Berei Rav Meri LeRavina. So Marzutra, the son of Rav Meri, says to Ravina, Ema, why don't you say this? Ki ahadre kra legabe matan damim ve'imurim debaya kahuna. Aval shchita de lo baya kahuna lo mebayit safa. Maybe they only brought it back into the general rule for things that the Kohen does. If you remember, shechita doesn't have to be done by a Kohen. Anyone can do shechita. Remember, even women can do shechita, even slaves can do shechita, any non-Kohen can do shechita. No. Why would that be an issue? So you might not have paid attention, but when I read the pasuk, this is why I read it in the beginning. Let's just go back again through the pasuk. right? Do it in the place where the sin offering and the burnt offering are done, b'mkom hakodesh. So now we're going to say, okay, that's one, right? There's another one by Zot Torat Hasham. Ki chachatat hashamu. Now, even though the blood in general, you do something different with it, but here the pasuk reins it in. But what does it say? Ki chatat hasham hu la kohen. It says the chatat is like an asham, or the asham is like a chatat for the kohen. Maybe it's only for kohen-related activities and not for shchita. And then you wouldn't be able to learn that shchita is ma'akev. Because that's when we say, oh, but then it brought it back into the general rule, that was only for things related to the kohen things, which are the matan damim, putting the blood on the altar, and the imurim being burnt. But maybe it's not reining it back in and saying it's part of the ruling for the slaughtering. And then what are you left with? Okay, it says this one has to be slaughtered in the north. It says all the other ashams have to be slaughtered in the north. Two separate tracks, because you can't learn one from the other. There's no pasuk that brings it back to the klal for that purpose. And therefore, you can't say it's ma'akev. So, the answer, im ken yemakra ki kachatat hu. My kachatat ha'asham kishar hashamot yeh. If it really wanted to say that this is like a sin offering, and which needs matan damim, it needs imurim, and just that, la kohen, it would have said, ki kachatat hu. This, it would call it this. It would use a pronoun because, right, it's what's the word? I don't know if I'm using a pronoun, it's a person, but this asham is like, right, it would just use the word this, and then it would say, this is like a sin offering. And you would know that. Why did it add the word ha'asham? Ha'asham is to tell you this asham is like all other ashamot. And that's how we in the end say this. So we started off pretty simple. And all we said is there's one pasuk here, there's one pasuk there, two pasukim, ma'akev. We got very complicated because we started to say, but there's this other drasha, talks about this case as this unique exception. It was taken out, it was put back in. But theoretically, they were saying maybe it was only put back in for one thing, not for other things, and maybe you can't really learn from here to all other Hashamot. But in the end, that word Hasham, which is really unnecessary, is coming to add also, right, that it really is like all other Hashamot, and then you can learn one from the other. So we complicated things, but in the end ended up with a pretty simple answer, which is this is really like all other Hashamot, in which case we have two mentionings of doing it in the north, or doing it like this, like the burnt offering, which is in the north, and all good. But there's one thing that we really glossed over, and that's the next question of the Gemara, which is, so if it wanted to say that it's ma'akev, then what should it have said? Slaughter the sheep in the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. But what did it say? Slaughter the sheep where the sin offering is, and where the burnt offering is. Why did you bother mentioning sin offering in the pasuk, right? You just could have mentioned burnt offering. So lama la'akushe l'chatat, lama la'akushe la'olah? Why do we need a hekesh to the chatat, to the sin offering, and to the olah? So Amar Ravina, itzrich. Why did you need it? Now what Ravina is going to prove, and I'm going to just say this outside first, because it's also a little bit convoluted argument. Ravina is going to say the reason why they mentioned sin offering is to teach you sin and burnt. If we had just said sin offering, what would be the problem? Davar lamei behekesh eno chozer lamei behekesh. We've seen this a number of times. Now we're going to really attack this issue head on. And we're going to say, this is the source for that halacha, that principle. Okay, this principle that if something's learned out from a juxtaposition, you can't then derive another law by juxtaposition, the same law to a different place. You can't do a juxtaposition, ola chatat, which is a juxtaposition. Because remember, it says, do the sin offering where the ola is. So they learn that's a hekesh. Ola's in the north, chatat's in the north. Then you can't do from chatat to asham. And that's why chatat's mentioned in this pasuk with the ola. Because what it's really trying to say, I'll tell you the bottom line and then we'll get back to it. If it just said ola, you would have said, okay, it's a hekesh, right? But the fact that it adds chata, and then maybe you could also do something else for hekesh, you wouldn't know. The fact that they're saying sin and then add burnt teaches you sin wouldn't have been enough. That's basically what they're going to say. But it's going to be a little more complicated than that, so let's read it inside. So he says, if it had done to sin offering, juxtaposed it to that, and not to an ola, well then I would have thought, havamina, Chata mehecha lamda me'ola. I would have thought, if it just said sin offering, do it in the place where the sin offering is done, then I would have thought, well, chatat is learned out from ola, from burnt offering, and then I would have thought, davar lamei be'hakesh, chozer lamei be'hakesh. And therefore it didn't just say sin offering, so that you'd know that you can't do that, okay? And that's because you would have thought, if it just said sin offering, you would have thought, oh, I can learn it. I can learn it from the sin offering, and the sin offering was one for the burnt offering, and that's not a problem. But obviously it is a problem. So it teaches you, really, that davar lamei be'hakesh is not chozer lamei be'hakesh. But Amar le Marzutra Berei de Rav Mary le Ravina, the same question, right, person who asked before, he asks also here. V'nikshe la'ola v'lo nikshe l'chatat. If you wanted to specifically use the ola, and it's right now they're just saying, if you had just said chatat, you would have thought something that's wrong, which is davar lamei be'hakesh could teach you also another hakesh. You could do a hakesh on a hakesh. But why don't you just then nikshe la'ola v'lo nikshe l'chatat? Why don't you just say, let's just compare it to the ola, not the sin offering, and then you would have known why we compare it to the ola, because it was directly the ola, it says it directly, and therefore we can learn from there to a hakesh. Right? So they say no, because hava amina davar lamei be'hakesh chozer lamei be'hakesh. Just because I said ola doesn't mean I would know then that only I could have used ola and not chatat. I might have thought they picked ola, but theoretically they could have picked chatat. Now, if you say well, then why didn't they use chatat? They must have chosen ola over chatat because ola was learned directly. But you could say, no, maybe it was just nichale de makish le'ikar v'lo makish le'tafel. Maybe you could just say, look, if you had a choice, you could have done either ola or sin offering. But you know what? The Torah obviously chose, learn it from the central one, the one where it says it explicitly, but not that you couldn't have learned it from the sin offering. That's why lahachi akshe lachataf akshe laola lememar tavar lemei be'hakesh eno chozer lemei be'hakesh, and that's why they put the chatat there. Because when you see the chatat and the ola, what do you realize? Chatat by itself wouldn't have worked, and that's how we learn this principle, at least according to Ravina. Rava learns it from somewhere else, and Rava is a little confusing because, well, not confusing, but it's a little confusing. But Rava does a whole line of drasha from a phrase that we actually learned this entire lining of drasha somewhere else from a different word. Not this phrase, but a different word, okay? I'll remind you for a minute. We haven't read it inside. But if you remember, we had a whole thing, asa lapar, kasher asa lapar, right? What's that word lapar doing there in the beginning? Either it's par Yom Kippurim, or it's the par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor. Now, it's in the psukim of the par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor, so why do you have to say lapar? You could just say, just like before, you could just say, due to it. You don't need to say, right, just like we said, you could have just said the Asham without using the word Asham. Why did it say the word par? And then we said to teach you, let's try to remember, it was to teach you that the par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor, okay, what was this for? The Klayot and the Yoteret HaKaveh have to be burned. Now, it only says that by the par Kohen HaMashiach. Now, when we get to Asa Lapal, and we're talking about the par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor, it says Lepar, for what reason? To say this is as if we're learning it explicitly, even though we didn't, but it's as if. And then we can learn from the par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor also to the Sirei of De Kochavim, so that also we know the Sirei of De Kochavim, you also have to burn the klayot, the kidneys, and the lobe of the liver. So that was what we learned from the word lepar. Now Rashi points out here that if you remember, because Lepar taught two different things, there were two different tracks. One school of thought said it's teaching Par Yom Kippurim. The other one said it's teaching this Yoteret HaKaved. It's saying, it's as if it was learned explicitly by Par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor, and from there we're going to learn it to the Sirei Avdei Kochavim. Right? Those are the Par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor for people when the people sin in idol worship. So, if you hold the Par is for Yom Kippurim, then you don't have that drasha, and this whole drasha that we're about to learn is going to do the exact same thing, but from different words, because for them, lepar is not available because it's used for par Yom Kippurim. I hope you understood that. If not, it's okay. It was an aside. It was just in case you start saying, wait, we learned this and we learned it from different words. You'll understand why. So now let's read it inside. So these psukim are actually not in the par Lim Dever Shel Tzibor, but in the par Kohen HaMashiach. When it talks about the par Kohen HaMashiach, it says you have to do, like I said, the two klayot and the Yoteret HaKaved, and all those have to be burned on the altar. It's the only place in these inner sin offerings where this is mentioned, and from there we're going to learn to all the others. And then it says, so burn those on the altar. I'm in Vayikra Dalet, Pasuk Yud now, chapter 4, verse 10. Ka'asher yuram mishor zevach hashlamim. Just like you take these also from a korban shlamim. Okay? That's what it's saying. And then Hiktiram HaKohen, and the Kohen burns them on the Mizbeach HaOlah, on the regular altar. So now the Gemara says the following. Okay, or Rava says, Mehacha, we're going to learn this principle specifically from here. Dichtiv. Kasher yuram mishor zevach hashlamim. L'may hilchatal. Why are they mentioning the shlamim in the middle of these sin offerings? What does this have anything to do with anything? If you want to say, well, like in the shlamim, you burn the two klayot and the lobe of the liver, the two kidneys and the liver, the lobe of the liver, well, begufei ktiv. You don't need to say we learn it from shlamim because it says it in the pasuk right before. It says it explicitly here. You burn in the par Kohen HaMashiach. It says, if the Kohen sins, right, by a mistaken ruling that he made, the Kohen Gadol, he has to do this, he has to do that, and he has to burn the fats, he also has to burn these things. Just like you do by the shlamim. Well, if just like you do by the shlamim means you have to burn those parts, we already said that. So it's obviously completely unnecessary. So, Ela mishum debai igmurei yoteret hakavedu shtei haklayot miparlim davar shel tzibur l'sirei avodah zarah. Well, the reason why they say this phrase is, now it's a little bit, really a drasha here, it's a bit of a jump, because it's in the section of the par of the Kohen HaMashiach, the Kohen Gadol. It says, well, since we want to learn from a hekesh of the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur, not this section, to the Sirei of De Kochavim, specifically to learn, well, just like by the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur, you have to burn the two kidneys and the lobe of the liver, which is learned out from the Par Kohen HaMashiach by hekesh. So, from there we learn to the Sirei of Dazarah. Now, you can't do that because it's a hekesh and a hekesh, right? You can't do a hekesh to a hekesh. So, mipar Kohen HaMashiach hu degam, right? Begufei lo ktiv. It doesn't say it explicitly in Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur. Umipar Kohen HaMashiach hu degamar, and it's derived from a hekesh of the Par Kohen HaMashiach. Lahachi itzrich kasher yuram denahave kamandachti begufei. Now we did this exact same thing. We said that's why it says lepar. Here it says that's why it says kasher yuram, to make it as if it's explicit. So this comparison within the Kohen HaMashiach to the shlamim is really trying to say that by the par Helen Davar Shel Tzibur, it's as if it was written explicitly. And then that allows us to darshan to the Sirei of Dazarah. Now, the fact that we had to go through this convoluted thing obviously proves to you what we're trying to prove, that you can't do a hekesh to a hekesh, otherwise you wouldn't have needed this phrase, okay? Because again, that's what Rava and Ravina are trying to prove. How do we know davar lamei be'akesh and chozer lamei be'akesh? Where do we get that principle from? So one said we get it from the fact that chatat is mentioned in that pasuk. The asham is compared also to the chatat and also to the olah, because it teaches you, chatat alone wouldn't have been enough. That's why they had to also add olah. And now we're saying this kasher yuram is coming to say the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur would never have been able to teach to the Sirei Avodah Zarah about the Yoteret and the Shtei Klayot because it wasn't said there. So this makes it as if it's explicitly stated. But the Gemara is going to ask just like they did before, right? So let's just read a little more. I'm just going to read this again. It's as if it's written explicitly. And it won't be so you won't get to that. It won't be hekesh teaching a law learned from hekesh, that now law learned by juxtaposition is now going to teach another law by juxtaposition. We don't want to get there, and that's why kasher yuram is there. So Amalei Rav Papa LeRava. Papa says to Rava, v'lichtich ve'begufei v'lo nakish. Why didn't the Torah just say it explicitly by Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur? Why did they go through this very, strange phrase that somehow teaching as if it's direct? Why didn't it just say it explicitly? Well, because ikata begufe, same thing as before. If it had written explicitly by Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur, and velo akish havamina davar malamei be'akesh chozer malamei be'akesh. If it had written explicitly and wasn't learned by a juxtaposition from the par of the Kohen Gadol to the par of Helim Davar Shel Tzibur, then, and we just learned from Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur directly, and then from there we did a hekesh to Sirei Avodah Zarah, what would be the problem? Just like last time. We would have thought, fine, this happens to be something learned directly and we can do a hekesh on it, but maybe in another case, something learned by juxtaposition could, and then you can make a juxtaposition on a juxtaposition, because it never says you can't. It just gives you an example where that's not the case. But theoretically, right, you could have thought that it would. And therefore, and if you want to say right, that it was derived explicitly, right? I'm sorry, that it was derived by hekesh. Nichale de katve begufe mida akish leakushe lahachi katva v'akshe. In other words, if you wanted to say theoretically, it could have been hekesh and hekesh, but they just wanted to write it so that you'd see it this way, right? So mida lahachi katve v'akshe. That's why it did it in this strange way, because they really wanted you to know lemeimra davar lemei behekesh ein chozer lemei behekesh. So again, if they had just written it explicitly, so it's true, you would have been able to derive it from a direct law, and that would have been fine. But it wouldn't have taught you the principle. So it does it in this strange way in order to get you to the principle. To see, were it not for this, you never would have been able to learn it. Okay, it's the same as before, parallel to the previous sugya, and that's how we learn it. So that's our whole section on what is the source for davar lemei behekesh, eino chozer lemei behekesh. Two possibilities, either the fact that chatat is mentioned, in addition to the Ola in the pasuk about the Asham, or, and that was in the leper case, or it's learned from the Shtei Klayot, and this extra phrase, Ka'asher Yuram, Mishor Zevach Shlamim, theoretically, by the way, the one who learned it from the Par, you could also use that as the proof, because it's the same exact limud. Now we have a siman, and you can see exactly where this is going in a minute. Hekesh u'gzera shava kavachomer u'binyan av siman. This is the siman for the next 4 sections. We're only going to do 2 of them today. One we just did, which is davar lemei behekesh ein chozer lemei behekesh imi derava imi deravina. That's just going back and saying, okay, something learned by juxtaposition, you then can't go and teach another law to something else. You can't do a juxtaposition on a juxtaposition. Okay, that we saw either from Rava or from Ravina, those 2 options we just saw a minute ago. Now the next question is, davar lemei behekesh ma'u she'elamed b'gzera shava. Well, can you do a gzera shava on a law derived by juxtaposition? If you learn something first by juxtaposition, and then you have a gzera shava, and obviously where are they going after this based on the siman? Can you do a kavachomer on a juxtaposition? Can you do a binyan ab, a paradigm on a juxtaposition? And that's going to be in tomorrow's stuff. So let's read the first one. Can you do a gzera shava on something learned by juxtaposition? Tashma, we're going to go back to leper, but a different part of the leprosy. There's leprosy on the body, there's leprosy on a house. So house and clothing. We're actually going to talk about clothing today, not the house. Clothing and a person. Rabbi Natan ben Avtum Musamir. Minayin lepricha b'bgadim shi Torah. Let's start with the person. If something covers your entire body, a leprous mark, a leprous mark means it's a leprous mark on your body. But if it covers your entire body, you're actually not a leper. It's a fascinating halacha. Okay, not to be discussed right now, but that's the halacha. Now, what if it covers the entire beged, the clothing, completely? So, how do we know that that's also Torah? It doesn't say so in the Torah. By the person, it says it explicitly. Well, ne'emar karacha v'gabacha b'bgadim, v'ne'emar karacha v'gabacha b'adam. So we're going to do a gzera shava. It says these 2 words, which basically means baldness, but baldness of the clothing, baldness of the head, and malahalam parach b'kulot Torah, just like by the head. If it gets on your entire head, not just your whole body, but if it's just on your complete, covers your head, not the rest of your body, it's also, you're going to be tahor. Likewise, if it covers the entire cloth, it's going to be tahor, and that we learn from gzera shava. Now, how do we know if it covers your entire head, you're tahor? I said that the Torah talks about if it covers your entire body, not your entire head. So that's going to be learned out from a hekesh. So just like there, parach b'klo tahor, avkam parach b'klo tahor, that's your gzera shava. V'hata minala. Now, where did we learn about the head? Dichtiv me rashova avraglav. V'yitakesh rosho laregel ma lahalam parach b'klo tahor, avkam parach b'klo tahor. There it says if it covers from your head to your feet. So the gzera shava is, right, you might have thought the simple reading is from your head to your feet, your whole body. But the drasha is, just like your feet, if it covers your whole body, it's going to be tahor. You're not going to be a leper. Also, if it covers your whole head, you're not going to be a leper. That's learned out from the hekesh with rosh to rega. And then we learned to gzera shava, so look, it works. But comes Rabbi Yochanan, rejects this, and this is where we'll end today. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, b'kol haTorah kula lemedim lamei milamed. In all of the Torah, we do learn hekesh from hekesh, gzera shava from hekesh. That's not a problem. We weren't asking about that. Chutz min hakodeshim she'ein danim lamei milamed. It's dafka by kodshim we don't. And how do we know that by kodshim we can't learn something hekesh then gzera shava? Because of one of the things we learned today. Din kain, but they're going to learn it differently. Lo ye'amer tzafona ba'asham, v'tite b'gzera shava de kodshim mechataot. You wouldn't have needed this whole asham Asham's like the Ola, right, where they learned at Hekesh from a direct law, because you could have actually learned it by Gzera Shava of Kodesh Kodshim. Remember I said Kodesh Kodshim in the Pasuk, note this? It says it multiple times, Kodesh Kodshim by Asham, and it also says by Chatat Kodesh Kodshim. So you could have just said, well, Chatat's learned out by a Hekesh, and then there's a Gzera Shava from Asham to Chatat of Kodesh Kodshim. So there you have it. We don't do that, right? We have this other way to learn it. So the fact that we don't do it from there must mean that you can't do that. Lav l'meimer, is it not to say davar l'mei behekesh ein chozer l'mei gzera shava? It must be because you can't learn a gzera shava from something that was learned out from a juxtaposition. So they say, no, maybe there's a different reason why we didn't do a gzera shava. Dilma mishum dika l'mifrach, because you could knock out that gzera shava by saying malachatach came achaper l'chai v'kritu. You can knock out a gzera shava, sometimes, we'll see in a minute when. If you have a reason why one is more stringent than the other, then you can't learn Gzera Shava. But if you remember, you can only do that if the word is not completely free. If the word in the pasuk that you're using for your Gzera Shava is actually not free, what does it mean not free? It means it's not an unnecessary word. If it's a needed word in the pasuk, and you want to do a Gzera Shava from it also, if there's a knockout, you can knock it out. But if it's completely unnecessary, that word, and you do a Gzera Shava, then it doesn't matter. You can't knock it out by saying, oh, that's more strict than that, and that's why we don't learn this. So Kodesh Kodshim Yeter K'tivei. It's written many times, and there's extra ones, and they're free. Because they're free, it's obvious that you could have done a Gzera Shava. And the reason why we didn't do a Gzera Shava is because Chatat itself was learned out by a juxtaposition, and you can't do a Gzera Shava on a juxtaposition. And with that, we finished for today with our, we did Hekesh, can't do a Hekesh. Hekesh can't do a Gzera Shava in the world of Kodshim, right? In the world of leprosy, you can. Remember, leprosy is not Kodshim. We did see leprosy was Kodshim earlier today because that was from the Psukim about the sacrifices. But the fact that someone becomes a leper is not the world of Kodshim. Okay, just don't get confused by that. So what did we do today? We started with how do we know that Ola needs Safon? And it's essential. We learned it either from Chatat, because Tafil is not going to be Chamor from the original one, and the Chatat is more already, we know that. Or because of this repetition of Bimkom HaOlah twice in Vayikra chapter 4, which means Bimkom HaOlah, it has to be done in its place. We had a question on the whole Tafil Menayikar, 3 questions, which we resolved. We then said, how do we know Asham needs Safon? And it could have been simple. One pasuk, Kazot Torah Asham, one pasuk, leper, but then it got all complicated because we said, isn't the leper pasuk needed for something else? And then we ended up saying, well, remember, it left the cloud, but it came back in, and then it came back in from all directions, basically, and therefore it's back in. Okay, and therefore it is like all the other Hashamot, and therefore we can learn from it. Then we got, well, why did that pasuk also mention Chatat? And from there we got one of the possible sources for how do you know something learned by juxtaposition can't then teach another juxtaposition? And other people learned it from the Paril and Davar Shel Tzibor, really in the pasuk by the Par Kohen Mashiach, but really relating to the Paril and Davar Shel Tzibor. And the last part was also about the Hekesh and the Gzera Shava. Can you do a Hekesh and a Gzera Shava? And then we're going to do, can you do a Hekesh and a Kal Chomer? Can you do a Hekesh and then a Binyan Av? With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.